Welcome back to When Harry Met Board Games, where we feed our people with relatable content, and our victory condition is your satisfaction. I'm Harry, and today we have another top 10 list for you all. Today I'm going to be sharing with you my top 10 asymmetric board games. Now, to be totally clear, when I'm talking about asymmetric board games, I'm not saying simply variable player powers, although variable player powers is one of the more common ways through which board games accomplish this type of asymmetry. I'm referring to board games in general that make all the players around the table feel unique and different from all of their opponents. Now, again, variable player powers is one of the many ways that they accomplish this, but there are other ways or other avenues to accomplishing this goal, and these 10 board games that I'm going to be sharing with you today, one way or another, managed to accomplish this. So without any further ado, let's go straight into my list with my number 10. My number 10 board game, my number 10 asymmetric board game is Agricola. And right here I have the Farmers of the Moor expansion because I didn't want to pull out my big box that's full to the brim with content and components and even a wooden insert. Agricola is a classic agricultural theme worker placement game where players are trying to grow their families, grow their farms, grow their livestock, and grow their veggies. And as they do this, they're simply taking worker placement actions in order to accomplish this. And round to round, there's going to be additional worker placement spots added to the board, and I find that to be really cool, really unique. It makes the game feel very progressive and almost story oriented, and you see that development from round to round. The game does not feel static, it does not feel the same. But one of the cool things about this game, and one of the ways that it accomplishes asymmetry, and very important to note because I believe this is the only Euro game that I have on this top 10 list, because Euro games aren't necessarily known for their asymmetry, right? One of the marks or the hallmarks of a Euro game is the idea of balance and equality, and quite often they accomplish this. Now, there are some games that kind of break from the mold and introduce things like variable player powers, which Agricola, that's not the way they accomplish it. They accomplish it through the use of these minor improvement cards and these occupation cards that players draft at the beginning of the game. And each player is going to have a hand of perhaps maybe 7, depending on what the players agree, which variant they agree to use, but roughly around 7 unique cards that's going to make them different from all the players around the table, especially in their strategy, because they're going to be mapping out their game with the idea of trying to combine and combo as much of those different occupation and improvement cards as possible. And as the game progresses and as they start accomplishing those improvements and those occupations and laying them down in their tableaus, they're going to just become even more asymmetric. The game is going to get more radically different as far as the players and their approaches and their strategies and what different worker placement spots mean to them. I find that to be a really cool thing that makes each game feel different, because you're never going to have the same exact combination of those 7 cards or 14 cards in your hand. So from game to game, you're always going to be trying different and unique approaches, which is why Agricola is my number 10 asymmetric board game of all time. And now we move on to my number 9 asymmetric game, and that is A Game of Thrones, the living card game, designed by Eric Lang and Nate French, the king of the living card games for Fantasy Flight. And this is based off the very massively popular intellectual property of Game of Thrones. It's really based on the novels, not necessarily the TV series, as the art is unique and it's not stills from the TV shows. But this game is really cool because it plays from 2 to 4 players, and each player controls a particular house from the Westeros universe. You got Lannisters and Starks and Targaryens, Greyjoys, and what have you. And based on your house, you construct a certain deck, mostly comprised of cards from your house, but there's a couple cards, a certain limit as far as the deck construction rules of cards outside of your house that you can include in your deck. But the point is that every player, based on their house and their unique deck, is going to feel radically different from the other players. Also, each house has a specific power. It's not something huge. It's not something earth-shattering, but it's usually something subtle and neat that gives them a certain boost or benefit that the other houses around the table may not necessarily have. And again, between that special power and the unique decks, all the expansions, the booster packs that you buy to add more cards to each of those houses, the players are going to feel radically different from one another, and they're going to have different strengths and weaknesses. One player may be very strong in military, military, while another player might be strong in intrigue. Also, you have these plot cards, which is also part of the deck construction or the pre-game setup preparation. And there's a lot of different plot cards, and there are some duplicates and repeats, so some players might share or have some overlap in their plot cards, but overall you're going to have a different plot deck than the player to your left, a player to your right, so you're going to feel unique as far as the plot deck is concerned as well. So it's really, really cool, really neat. Again, you feel different, and if you're into the intellectual property, it adds a certain additional bonus to the gameplay and to the immersiveness as you try to role play, or I guess pretend that you are said house. My number 9 asymmetric board game, a Game of Thrones the living card game. And now we move on to my number 8 asymmetric board game, and that is Summoner Wars. And this game here, first of all, big news, they're recently they just had a second edition released for this game. And the second edition, from what I read, changes a lot of things, cleans up a lot of things. It kind of streamlines some mechanisms, makes some mechanisms a little bit more intuitive or more player-friendly. So from what I've read, it sounds like a very positive thing. Also, the graphic design is modernized and more, I guess, aesthetically pleasing. Although this is a pretty good-looking edition as well. I might somewhere down the line consider purchasing that second edition, but for now, I'm good with this edition right here. And here I have the master set, and there are 8 factions here that are included in this game, and each faction plays radically different than one another. Now, the end game trigger or the end game condition is the same from game to game. The skeleton of the rules, as far as the different phases that players go through and their limits and stuff like that, is all the same. However, the strengths of the different characters and the different tactics that players will be partaking in based on the faction that they drew. Some factions might be helpful to be more aggressive as far as attack is concerned. Other factions might have like a self-sacrificing emphasis where their characters mean nothing and you're incentivized to sacrifice them in order to gain or to recruit more powerful creatures from that faction. Again, no matter what faction you pick, you're always going to feel like you're different from the other player that you're playing against, which is why Summoner Wars is my number 8 asymmetric board game of all time. And now we move on to my number 7 asymmetric board game, and that is Small World. And for lots of people, this might be higher ranked. This game is a really cool area control game where players are taking on the roles of different fantastical races, although it is a little bit cartoony in its artwork and its presentation. But you're taking control of these different fantasy races, and you're trying to combat for the different terrains that make up the Small World map. And this game is cool because no matter what the player count, it's going to be very tight because the game comes with 2 boards, 2 double-sided boards to accommodate anywhere from 2 to 5 players. So you're always going to feel that tightness, that pressure, that there's not enough space for you to dominate in this land, and therefore you're going to be forced to attack your opponents around the table. And it's really cool because each player starts the game with a particular race and a particular power. And the race tile and the power tiles are separate tiles that are joined together to make one combined grand race with 2 unique abilities. So because of the 2 separate tiles, the combinations, the configurations, and the permutations of all these different powers combined with the actual race, it's so infinite. I can't do the mathematics, but the replayability is very high because you're not always going to find the same combination of creature or fantasy race and power. So again, each player is going to feel so different because of that, because you're going to have advantages that perhaps other players around the table do not have. You might have some advantages that might be similar to what someone else might have, but not quite the same. So again, very, very highly asymmetric, fun area control game. My number 7 asymmetric board game, Small World. My number 6 asymmetric board game is Keyforge, designed by Richard Garfield and published by Fantasy Flight Games. And this game is Richard Garfield, same designer as Magic the Gathering, and some very similar concepts. It's a 2-player tactical card game where players are summoning different creatures and basically combating with one another. However, the goal is not just physical dominance or attack-oriented dominance. You are attacking your creatures and trying to hopefully eliminate players' creatures to make them more vulnerable and to also strengthen your possibilities on your side. But really what you're trying to do is you're trying to accrue this particular resource that the game refers to as Ember, and eventually turn in enough of these Embers to forge 3 different keys and be the player to win the game. Really cool because each booster deck that you purchase in this game is already constructed and ready for play, and each deck that you buy is unique to all the decks out there, because what this game has, it has a ton of different factions and a pool of card among those different factions, and every deck has a different combination of 3 of those factions, as well as a different configuration of the listed cards that are within that faction's pool of cards. So again, you're always going to have a unique deck from that other player. You might have some overlap in some of the factions, but there's no guarantee that you have the same exact cards even within that faction. So you're always going to feel absolutely different, and your approach and your strategy is always going to be revolving around or mapped around the strengths of those 3 different factions that your deck consists of. Really cool, really fun, asymmetric. My number 6 asymmetric board game of all time, Keyforge. And now we move on to the top 5, the cream of the crop. These are my favorite games that happen to be asymmetric, and also the ones that I think are most asymmetric. And with that being said, we move on to my number 5, and that is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Shadow of the Past. And this is a 1 versus all game, although the standalone expansions did add a cooperative only mode. The base game is a 1 versus all, where one player is the Overlord, takes on the role of Shredder and all the villains and his henchmen, and the other group of players take on the role of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles themselves: Raphael, Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Donatello. And the thing about these type of games, these 1 versus all Overlord type games, is that they are ready lend themselves to asymmetry, because usually the goal and the objective for the Overlord player is kind of like the counterpart, the antithesis of whatever the goal is for the heroes, the good guys, the team of players. So that already lends to itself to asymmetry. But the other thing that makes it asymmetric is that the heroes play a mostly dice-oriented game. For the most part, they're rolling dice, and those dice allow them to resolve certain actions. There is a little bit of card play sprinkled in, but for the most part, the heroes are partaking in dice play, dice rolling. The Overlord, on the other hand, the villains, the player controlling the villains, they're only partaking in card play. Yes, conflict is always going to be resolved with dice, but all their other actions are determined by the cards they play. They choose to play 2 cards per turn, and those 2 cards are going to govern all the actions that they can do on said turn. So that is really, really cool. Sometimes the cards that you play give you lingering benefits that you can use defensively on the Turtles' turn, or sometimes the group of cards, they pile up, they remain on the Overlord's tableau for some time over the course of a few turns, and they can benefit from cards that they played on a previous round in a future round. So again, really, really cool. 2 different ways of trying to accomplish their turns. One player, the heroes, the group of players, they resolve it through dice rolls, and the Overlord player resolves it through card play. Really cool. My number 5 asymmetric board game of all time, TMNT Shadows of the Past. And now we move on to my number 4 asymmetric board game of all time, and this game is probably my favorite on this list, but I gotta admit that the others on top of this list, on top of this game, are more asymmetric and provide that asymmetry in more interesting and creative ways. My number 4 is Cosmic Encounter. Classic board game. I've talked about it a lot in this channel. I think it's a great negotiation game, political game, and a great representation of the variable player power. And that is how this game accomplishes this goal. And while lots of the games on this list don't necessarily focus on variable player power, the thing about Cosmic Encounter is that these alien races that each player control feel so radically different, and there are hundreds of races. If you combine, the base game alone comes with like 50, and there's 6 expansions, and each of them add dozens of races to the pool that you could select from. These races just feel so different. It's not this minor little thing. Sometimes the wording seems minor, but its implementation, as you actually play the game, as you carry it out, you realize how different it is. And the races absolutely determine your approach, your strategy. Sometimes the races make you lean towards aligning yourself with one player versus the other. Sometimes the races and your knowledge, or perhaps your fear of those races, keep you from messing or attacking certain players. You probably want to gain the favor of certain players. You probably want to stay on their good side because their powers seem to be that threatening, at least overtly and obviously intimidating. Again, each player race feels so different. It's so exciting just to even draw your player race at the beginning of the round. I always do it that we draw randomly. Sometimes we draw two and we pick from one. We pick one from those two. But it's always so exciting just to even expect and wonder which race you're going to get and how to implement it. Because again, there's so many races here that quite often you're playing with a race for a new time, for the first time, even if you've played this game hundreds of times, because there's so many races to play with. My number 4 asymmetric board game of all time, Cosmic Encounter. My number 3 asymmetric board game of all time is War of the Rings, 2nd edition by Ares Games. And this game here, first of all, it takes place in the massively popular Lord of the Rings Middle-earth Tolkien universe. And it captures so much of the spirit of that story, of that movie, of that series. This game here, first of all, it's a two-sided game, 2 players. I think you can play 4 players by dividing it into 2 players per team. But 1 player or group of players take on the role of the Fellowship, led by Frodo and Samwise Gamgee. And the Fellowship consists of all of the members that were there from the very beginning, including Boromir and Legolas and Gimli. And the other player, or players, take on the role of the Shadow, or the forces of Sauron. And the game is so asymmetric because not only are there different endgame conditions, for the most part, the Shadow player is going to be playing a attack-heavy war game where they're just going to be attacking different strongholds and hopefully taking them over. The Fellowship player is playing a little bit of that. They're trying to fend off the forces of evil and win some battles, or at least not lose too many strongholds. But while they can win by claiming a certain amount of strongholds, it's a fewer amount than the Shadow player, their main objective is to progress Frodo along the path to Mordor to destroy the One Ring. And they're doing this through a back and forth mechanism where sometimes they go undercover and they're hidden, and the Shadow player does not know where they're at, although they have an idea based on their last reappearance. However, every once in a while they have to reappear, or they're forced to reappear, and then again the Shadow player has a good idea as to where that player or where the Fellowship stands. And throughout the game, the Fellowship has to make the tough decision of disbanding and letting some of their members from the Fellowship go to other places on the map so they could help in the efforts of fending off the forces of evil as they try to attack the different regions, the free lands of Middle-earth. Really, really cool. But not only is the endgame trigger and the process all different, but even mechanically speaking, we're rolling a dice. A lot of what's taking place is the dice rolling, but there's a different amount of dice. The evil players, the Shadow forces, they're rolling tons of dice, while the Fellowship player is only rolling about a handful of dice, maybe 4 or 5 dice. And based on what they roll, they carry out their actions. And again, it all comes out totally different. If you play one side versus the other, you're going to have a completely different experience. But if you're a fan of the intellectual property, you're going to enjoy it either way. My number 3 asymmetric board game, War of the Ring. And now we move on to my number 2. And my number 2 is a game that I have just recently played for the first time. And even though I only have 1 play of it, it's a long game. So with these longer games, you kind of get a good gist of the game even after only 1 play. But it just so qualifies for this list. And it's funny, I wasn't even thinking about having this game on the short list until I played it. And that's a Game of Thrones, the board game. Earlier, I had the living card game. Here, I have the board game. And the cool thing about this game, first of all, it's a conflict-heavy political game where players are basically trying to take over the Iron Throne. And they're doing this through lots of negotiation, intrigue, alliances, and ultimately combat and warfare. And what's cool is that every player takes on one of the respective houses of Westeros. This base game here only comes with 6 of the houses. It comes with Lannisters, Starks, Greyjoy, Baratheon, Martell, and Tyrell. And each of the players take on the role of one of these houses. And each of these houses, first of all, have their own starting locations, which is based on the geography and the map of the land of Westeros. But they also come with their own specific set of cards. And these cards are very important because these cards are cards that you play to resolve combat and sometimes trigger other effects. And each player has a different unique set of cards based on their house and the particular characters that are affiliated with their house. But that's not really where the asymmetry lies. The asymmetry lies in the fact that there's all these different tracks that players are keeping track of. You have the victory track, you have the supply track, you have the Iron Throne track and the fiefdom track and the King's Court or the Royal Court track. All these different tracks. And players have their tokens, their house-related tokens, on all of these tracks on a different spot of the track to start the game with. So while the Baratheons have an advantage as far as the Iron Throne is concerned, they might have a disadvantage as far as the Royal Court. Right? The Greyjoys might be very far behind in the track as far as the Iron Throne is concerned, but they might be really high in the track as far as the fiefdom track is concerned. And again, even the victory track, not all the houses start on the same spot. So from the very beginning, this game is imbalanced, and every player has certain advantages and disadvantages at their disposal. And I find that to be really, really cool. It's such a cool and unique way. Now, I will give a very huge caveat. This game here is a very long game. Teaching takes a while, and playing it for the first time will obviously take a while. And I think even once you become a veteran or an experienced player, it probably will never play under 2 hours. So that's something for people to keep in mind. But if you like the intellectual property and you can kind of plan an event around this, which is kind of what I did over this past weekend, then this game is a great selection for that event. My number 2 asymmetric board game of all time, A Game of Thrones, the board game. And now, finally, we move on to my number 1. And I've actually mentioned this several times over the course of the past year in different videos, that to me, this game is kind of like the poster child of asymmetry. I love this game. It might not necessarily be my favorite among these 10, but it's, to me, the most asymmetric. My number 1 is Android Netrunner, another living card game from Fantasy Flight. A lot of these games here are either LCGs or Fantasy Flight games overall. And this game takes place in the Android universe, and it's a sequel to the Netrunner CCG that existed back in the mid-90s from Richard Garfield. However, this is a reimagining by Lucas Litzinger and Fantasy Flight. And the cool thing about this game is that each player not only takes an opposite side in this battle. One player is the runner, the hacker, and the other player is the rich corporation. And the hacker is trying to break into or hack into the servers of the corporation and steal as much agendas as possible, while the corporation is trying to secretly and subtly and quietly accomplish as much of these agendas as possible. And whoever accomplishes their objective first is the winner. But it's so cool because but it's done in such a different way. The runner is playing a very aggressive, assertive, combat-heavy approach of a game, while the corporation is kind of dancing around the Netrunner. The corporation is playing a little bit of a game of chicken, a little bit of bluffing even, and trying to really play a mind game on the runner, so the runner cannot figure out whether or not their servers have either a really valuable agenda that can get them points, an asset that might not necessarily mean anything to the Netrunner, or maybe even some other card that might be detrimental to the Netrunner and hurt them if they attempt to hack. So really, really cool as far as that's concerned. But this game is so asymmetric that even the terminology that's used in this game is different from one side to the other, which makes it a little bit of a pain to learn and to teach to other people, which is why I've only played this with one player. And I'm not sure if I have any interest in teaching this to anybody else that I game with, because again, it is a little bit laborious to go through all those different terms and what they mean. But again, that just shows how committed Lucas Lissinger and Fantasy Flight were to the asymmetry in this game. The fact that a player's hand is referred to as one thing if you are the corporation and a totally different thing if you are the runner. Same thing with the discard pile. Same thing with the deck of cards. Same thing with your player area. Really, really cool. Even the amount of actions you can take from one, I think the Netrunner gets to take 4 actions, while the corporation only gets to take 3 actions, but they get a mandatory drawing of a card, which kind of takes the place of an action and keeps things balanced. Really cool, really fun. Again, if you're up for the learning curve, not necessarily from a gameplay perspective, but again, from just keeping the terms and everything organized. If you're up for that learning curve, this is a game you might want to look into. I do believe it's out of print, but there are ways of getting affordable copies. So my number 1 asymmetric board game of all time, Android Netrunner. And that's it for today's video, guys. Thank you so much for joining us here at When Harry Met Board Games. Please comment down below. Tell me what's your favorite asymmetric game of all time. Perhaps you don't like asymmetric games and prefer games that are hyper balanced. I'm interested in reading what you guys have to say. This is Harry saying take care, everybody. Stay safe, stay healthy, and have fun gaming. Bye-bye.